The end of a scene is not usually the end of your story. That means when a reader reaches the end of your scene, you don't usually want them to stop reading, which is really easy for them to do if you completely conclude the events of that scene right there. So today I want to talk about how to write scene endings that keep readers reading. We do this in two ways. We keep readers reading by revealing new information that they want to know more about, and by ending at a place with high tension and stakes. We're going to go over several types of endings that do both of these. And I do want to remind you that sometimes we find our endings in revision, so if you hang on until the end of this video, I'll tell you how you can get a free revision checklist that'll help you with your scene endings. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. Let's start with types of scene endings that reveal new information. Controlling the release of information is vital to the success of your story. When you reveal your character's secret, or who the real antagonist is going to affect everything from the tension to the pace to the tone of your story. When you reveal new information can either pique your reader's interest or satisfy them. If a reader feels too satisfied, they're going to stop reading, and there's no guarantee that they will pick your book up again to finish it. Satisfaction is part of the emotion we want for the very end of our book, not at the end of a scene necessarily. So we need to control that release of information. One way we can do this is by pairing a new mystery every time we answer a question or solve an old one. That's what some of these examples of endings that release new information do. So the first of these is to end with a character epiphany. This is where at the end of your scene, your character comes to some realization, but we stop right there. We don't let them make any decision about that realization or really show what they're going to do about it. All we do is show that they have figured out something, and a reader has to keep reading to see what they do with this new information, this epiphany. Here's an example of that type of ending from Hexed by Kevin Hearn. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision drew my head to the right, and I got a glimpse of a slim woman cloaked in a hellish juju fleeing around the corner toward Mitchell Park. If I hadn't been using my fairy specs, I wouldn't have seen her at all. She was definitely one of them. And now I had a name for an old enemy. At the end of this scene, the main character, Atticus, has just won a major battle, so the reader knows what happens with that conflict. But right at the end of that battle, just before the scene ends, the character has an epiphany. He puts two and two together and realizes he's dealing with an old enemy. As a reader, we don't know much about what this means quite yet, and we don't know what he's going to do with that information, but we definitely want to find out. When you use this character epiphany, it can release new information, keep your story moving, but it also shows that your character is intelligent and paying attention. So it's doing lots of things all at once. Another example of a scene ending that releases new information is to end by revealing a major obstacle. So the character might have completed one obstacle, overcome one conflict, but now suddenly they've realized that there is something much bigger standing in their way, or what they are attempting to do is much harder than they thought it would be. So we end by revealing this new challenge. In Thunderhead and most of the Scythe trilogy, Neil Shusterman does this often. He will often end with the revelation of a new obstacle to not only release new information, but to also up the tension and stakes, all at the same time. Now I'm going to provide an example from Thunderhead, but this is a spoiler alert. What I'm going to talk about is a major twist in that book. So if you want to read them and you haven't, I recommend skipping ahead a couple of minutes. She reached over, turned on the light, and the reality of the situation hit Rowan with both barrels. Because although it was Tiger Salazar sitting in the wheelchair, it wasn't Tiger who Rowan found himself looking at. he was looking at the smiling face of Scythe Goddard. That's where the scene ends. And if you haven't read this series, that might not seem like much of an obstacle. But Scythe Goddard is the villain from book 1. And in book 1, he was beheaded, so everyone thought he was dead. And now suddenly he is sitting in front of one of the main characters. What we don't get is this character's reaction to that information, what they're going to do next, anything like that. The scene ends right there, and we move on to another scene. But a reader is definitely going to keep reading after finding out about this new obstacle in the character's way, this new conflict, the return of the old villain. So that's an example of how a scene ending with the release of information about a new obstacle can compel a reader to keep reading. No one is going to stop here. You can also end with the promise of a future revelation. So maybe you end by only delivering a partial bit of information, or something that the character doesn't quite put together yet, or the promise that they're about to discover something. Maybe you end by pointing them down a different path to discover information. That's another way that you can keep a reader reading with information. Dennis L. McKiernan does this often in his book, Once Upon a Summer's Day. This book is about a character trying to find another character who's been trapped, and him and his friends are constantly getting new information, but they can't quite seem to piece it together. This is what that looks like. But as the silvery light from above crept across the garden, Burrell glanced at the waning moon and said, "Tell me this, my love, how do you know that there is less than a moon?" Of a sudden they were back in the enshadowed turret. Left. Her voice trembling in dread. "Rashibi told me," whispered Shell, and the stone walls began to waver, and there was naught Burrell could do to hold on to the dream. This information is the promise of a future revelation because Burrell has gotten a name of someone who knows about Shell's plight and who might be able to help him. But he doesn't know if this is friend or foe. He doesn't know what to do with that information. All we have is a name to go on. So it's the promise of a future revelation in a way. What this type of information reveal does is it does not answer a question. It doesn't answer where Shell is. It doesn't answer how to find her. But it points the character down a new path, a new train of thought that they might use to find that answer. That's why it's the promise and not a true revelation. So those are 3 types of endings that you can use that are centered around revealing new information. You can end with a character epiphany. You can end by revealing a new obstacle, or you can end with the promise of a future revelation. Let's move on to types of high tension and stakes scene endings. We're going to jump right into the first one, ending mid-action. This type of scene ending is similar to ending on a cliffhanger. We're going to stop before the resolution. So we reach the climax of the scene, but we stop before that moment of falling action where readers get a sense of satisfaction, where they're able to relax because the major conflict is over. So we stop just before then. And a reader is definitely going to want to keep reading because they're reading for that relief sensation. They want to get to that point of satisfaction. Patricia Briggs uses this type of ending in the beginning of Bloodbound to keep a reader reading after chapter 1. And that is a great place to use this type of scene ending. Here's what it looks like. In despair, I realized I hadn't seriously harmed him. He dropped me to the ground and backed away, his hands covering the wound I'd made. I felt his magic flare, and when his hands moved away from his throat, the wound was gone. He snarled at me, his fangs showing, and I snarled back. I don't remember seeing him move, just his hands on my sides, a brief moment while I was hurled through the air, and then nothing. And that's the end of chapter 1. In this scene, the main character and one of her close friends are battling a demonic vampire, and we don't know if they make it out or not. We don't know if she survives, but probably since she's the main character and this is book 2 in a series. We don't know if he survives for sure, but more importantly, we don't know what's going to happen when she wakes up. Is she going to be a captive? Is she going to be bleeding out? What's going to happen when she awakens? So that's an example of stopping mid-action and how it can compel a reader to keep reading. This type of ending is particularly useful if you're writing a more action-packed type of story, but I do want to caution you about overusing this or any of the scene endings we're talking about. Variety is the spice of life. You should be using it in your scenes and scene endings as well. The other type of scene ending that adds tension and raises the stakes is ending with emotional turmoil. After a particularly harrowing scene or one that reveals needed new information, your character has to process what has just happened, what they've just learned. And these scenes can be filled with emotional turmoil, where a reader really gets to watch them squirm and might end up squirming themselves. We need to see this inner part of the character in order to understand how they're going to grow and how they're being affected by the story. And then where we choose to end that scene is going to compel a reader to keep reading. So if we show this emotional turmoil, but don't show what they choose to do with it, we're going to create tension and raise the stakes, but not make a reader feel satisfied enough to stop reading there. Here's what this looks like in J.J. Marshall's Dark Tides. Aaron let out a sigh and dropped his chin to his chest. Yes, he loved her, but he loved his kingdom more. Perhaps heartbreak was the only way to spare what feelings they both had. Perhaps having her loathe him would be better than the broken look on her face. He couldn't do this. Turning on his heel, Aaron retreated from whence he came. He had a fish to find and a duty to uphold. The only heartbreaking was his. In an earlier scene, Prince Aaron found out that who he was engaged to has been changed by his father, the king. He is no longer engaged to the woman he loves, and now he's trying to decide if he should tell her himself or let her find out at the royal announcement with the rest of the kingdom. And we know that that choice, or lack thereof, is going to cause conflict later on. So as a reader, we want to keep reading to see what happens. That's how ending with emotional turmoil can up the tension, maybe raise the stakes, and keep your readers invested. So some endings that do both of those things are ending mid-action and ending with emotional turmoil. Next, I want to share an editor and author's advice on ending scenes. These scene endings are not an all or nothing thing. A scene can both reveal new information and up the tension and stakes at the same time. There is some overlap. So they're not as cut and dry as they might seem on the surface, which is good because both of those things are going to drive your story forward, they're going to keep your pace up, and they're going to keep your reader reading. Now, one other thing that you want to watch out for when you're ending your scenes is to not end your scene and chapter at the same time, especially if you're not using the type of scene ending that's going to compel your reader to keep reading. So you don't want your scene endings and your chapter endings to always align. Sometimes if you don't have a strong ending that's going to compel a reader to keep going, but you like that ending anyway, don't end your chapter there, and that will be good enough to keep a reader reading. Here's what this looks like from Denver City Justice by J.V.L. Bell. The sheriff glanced at Millie, his tone none too friendly. Mrs. D, you didn't remove anything from this cabin, did you? He looked down at her bulging apron. That's where the chapter break happens. So the reader has to keep reading into the next chapter to find out this. Millie followed Sheriff Reynolds' gaze and saw a rectangular shape clearly outlined inside her apron pocket. Glancing up at his misshapen face, she swallowed. The new chapter picks up right where the last chapter cut off, so it's not a mid-action scene ending, because the scene did not end. The scene is continuing, it's just the chapter that ended and started a new one. But the reader is definitely going to keep reading because they want to know what happens in the rest of the scene. They want to know if Millie got caught stealing that evidence. What all of these scene endings are doing is making sure you don't have too many places in your story where a reader can naturally stop reading. If there are places where they feel it's okay to stop, stick in their bookmark, and move on, they might not pick up your book again. They might not finish it. They could be distracted by other things in their life. There are lots of things vying for readers' attention. So we need to make sure that our book and the scene endings are compelling enough that they have to return to find out what happens. And we do that by ending with new information and ending in a way that ups the tension and stakes. How do you end your scenes to do this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more videos on scenes and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. There is where you will find that revision checklist I talked about that will help you craft these kinds of scene endings. And I've linked to it in the description below. If you want to see how I approach scene endings in my own writing, you will find that at caitlinburvey.com. That's where my personal fantasy writing lives. And now it's your turn to end your scenes in a way that reveals new information and ups the tension and stakes to keep your readers reading and ignite your ink.